You are a royal physician within the Grand Palace of Madrid. The year is 1834. Though the king has passed away, your duty has yet to conclude. You have been summoned to attend to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand II, tasked with an extraordinary and unsettling mission that challenges your very sanity. Before you stands Queen Regent Maria Cristina, tearful, with a request that sends a chill through your veins. As you approach the king's lifeless form, it is not his face that captivates you, but what lies concealed beneath the silken sheets, a grotesque physical anomaly embodying the cruelty, paranoia, and betrayals that marked his reign. Ferdinand's notorious deformity, both his deepest shame and twisted pride, would become a whispered secret through centuries of history, scarcely mentioned in official records. As you prepare to preserve this macabre relic, your thoughts drift to the whispered palace tales, special cushions, anguished wives, desperate efforts to produce an heir despite nature's cruel jest. You realize you are not merely preserving a body, but the very physical incarnation of a reign that was malformed, immense, and devastating to all it touched. Before journeying into this harrowing tale of survival and suffering, if you find revealing the hidden depths of history compelling, consider liking and subscribing for more. And please share in the comments where you're listening from. I treasure how we trace these ancient stories across continents, united by our shared curiosity about the past. You are the royal physician in Madrid's palace in 1834. Though King Ferdinand II has passed away, your duty is far from over. Summoned to the late monarch's private chambers, you face a task so surreal that doubt creeps into your mind. Before you stands Queen Regent Maria Cristina, her eyes brimming with tears, delivering a chilling request that unsettles you deeply. As your trembling hands approach Ferdinand's lifeless form beneath the silk sheets, the man who ruled Spain with fear and cruelty for 2 decades seems to mock you from beyond the grave. Yet, it is not his face that commands your attention. It is what lies hidden beneath, an anatomical grotesquerie that came to embody the torment of his reign. Ferdinand VII bore an abnormally large and deformingly shaped endowment, a physical anomaly that brought him both immense shame and a perverse sense of pride. As you begin the preservation, your thoughts drift to whispered palace tales, of specialized cushions, of wives' anguished screams, of desperate efforts to father an heir against the cruel designs of nature. What you are preserving is not just flesh and bone, but the very symbol of a reign twisted, oversized, malformed, and devastating to all it touched. To truly grasp the tragic narrative of Ferdinand II, one must first acknowledge the dire origins of his existence, a legacy steeped in a relentless cycle of royal inbreeding. His bloodline, a tangled web of Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons, was bound by generations of unions forged between cousins and close relatives, creating a genetic landscape wrought with peril. This hereditary entanglement was no mere matter of tradition. It fashioned a toxic inheritance that manifested in physical deformities and profound mental instability across the royal family. Born on October 14, 1784 at the Escorial Palace, Ferdinand was the direct product of such a perilous union, the son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, first cousins whose marriage sealed his fate from the beginning. This rigged genetic lottery meant that Ferdinand inherited more than just royal titles. He bore the heavy burden of physical anomalies and psychological suffering that would haunt him throughout his life. His very body, a testament to centuries of concentrated lineage, marked him as both the epitome and a victim of royal decay, setting the stage for a reign defined by dysfunction and despair. As a young prince, Ferdinand's early years were a crucible of torment and dysfunction that would forge the man he became, a tyrant defined by cruelty and paranoia. Born into a family riddled with internal strife, Ferdinand was the son of Charles IV, a monarch more interested in hunting than ruling. and Maria Luisa, whose scandalous affair with Spain's powerful minister, Manuel de Godoy, was an open secret within the palace walls. Witnessing his mother's public infidelity and his father's weakness, Ferdinand absorbed bitter lessons about power, loyalty, and betrayal from an early age. Yet the most profound influence shaping Ferdinand's psyche was the grotesque anomaly that marked his own body. Unlike any prince before him, Ferdinand was burdened with an enormous and disturbingly malformed endowment. The whispers of courtiers and servants echoed relentlessly through palace corridors, turning his intimate shame into a source of relentless mockery. The ridicule he endured was devastating. Others saw his condition as a grotesque oddity, but he internalized it as a deep personal humiliation. This taunting bred within the young prince a seething resentment and mistrust. He began to see the world around him as a place filled with hidden jabs and conspiracies aimed at undermining his dignity. Tutors and courtiers could offer no comfort. Instead, their sterile glances and veiled jokes deepened his paranoia. Over time, Ferdinand grew secretive and vindictive, wielding his emerging authority to punish anyone who displeased him. An infamous episode detailed in the memoirs of a court chaplain recounts how the prince exacted cruel retribution on a young page who had accidentally glimpsed him changing, sending both the boy and his family into exile. As adolescence dawned, these experiences crystallized into a toxic combination of insecurity and wrath. Ferdinand was not merely a boy grappling with physical differences. He was a prince learning to convert personal powerlessness into public dominance, using cruelty as a shield against vulnerability. The seeds of his later despotism were planted in the shadows of this troubled youth, where physical deformity and familial dysfunction intertwined to shape a ruler whose paranoia and tyranny would haunt Spain for decades to come. You find yourself as the royal physician summoned to witness one of the most harrowing moments in Ferdinand II's life, his attempts at intimacy with his first wife, Maria Antonia. The narrative unfolds like a nightmare. Far from the romantic ideal expected of royal unions, their marriage reveals a tragic cycle wrought with humiliation and failure. Maria Antonia arrived at the Spanish court full of youthful hope and tender dreams, believing in the fairy tale of the desired one she had heard about. The wedding itself was majestic, the city alive with celebration, and the young couple outwardly a perfect match. Yet behind this splendid facade lurked the grim reality of Ferdinand's overwhelming physical abnormality. When the bridal chamber was prepared with specially designed cushions, oils, and implements to aid what should have been a natural act, it became painfully clear that their wedding night would be far from ordinary. The Queen's first sight of Ferdinand's grotesquely sized and strangely formed member was so shocking that she reportedly screamed in terror, overwhelmed by the sight of this monstrous appendage. Witnesses later described her reaction as hysteria. She recoiled as if confronted by a demon, her spirit breaking under the weight of unexpected horror. What followed was less a night of love and more a dire medical procedure, with physicians stepping in to guide what intimacy was possible. Ferdinand needed his custom supports to prevent injury during these encounters. But even so, the ordeal was so utterly traumatic for Maria Antonia that she depended heavily on medication just to endure it. This dreadful ritual repeated itself relentlessly, transforming their marital obligations into a ghastly routine of suffering and submission rather than affection and connection. The psychological toll was devastating on both. Ferdinand's paranoia and insecurity deepened, wounded further by his wife's obvious revulsion. Maria Antonia, in turn, developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe sexual trauma, increasingly reliant on sedatives to escape the pain, not only physical but emotional, imposed by her coerced role. Their attempts at producing an heir became desperate and fraught. Ferdinand, convinced that Maria Antonia's disdain was the cause of their failure, resorted to more sinister measures. Court records reveal his commissioning of restraining devices to compel her compliance, crafted with the same ingenuity used for royal saddles and weapons. He consulted astrologers and charlatans alike, hoping to manipulate fate and his wife's will. Despite fleeting moments of hope when Maria Antonia twice conceived, tragedy struck with devastating miscarriages, each loss leaving wounds deeper than the last. The Queen's fragile constitution never recovered. Her health continued to decline under the compounded burdens of physical trauma, addiction, and psychological torment. Her final demise at just 21 years old was officially attributed to fever, yet it was this relentless despair that truly claimed her. Throughout, Ferdinand's response was chillingly selfish. Rather than offering comfort, he accused his wife of betrayal, sabotage, and secret conspiracies, beclouded by paranoia that corroded what little remained of their relationship. Maria Antonia's last days were marked by prayer for forgiveness for sins she neither committed nor comprehended. This tragic union, laden with shame, cruelty, and failure, set a dark precedent not only for Ferdinand's personal life but for a kingdom already teetering on the edge of chaos. The nightmare of their marriage foreshadowed the wreckage that would define his reign, a reign distinguished by intimate horrors concealed behind royal splendor. Following the death of Maria Antonia, Ferdinand's paranoia and cruelty intensified significantly, plunging him deeper into a psychological abyss from which he would never emerge. The trauma of their failed union, compounded by the humiliations of his physical condition and her tragic demise, twisted his mind into a labyrinth of suspicion and bitterness. No longer content with merely hiding his insecurities, Ferdinand transformed his paranoia into a weapon against those around him, perceiving enemies in every shadow. His distrust extended to close confidants and family alike, fracturing any remaining bonds of loyalty. This pervasive suspicion bred an environment of fear and manipulation, where genuine human connection became impossible. Ferdinand's behavior grew increasingly erratic and vindictive, enforcing his will through petty cruelties and ruthless purges against those he deemed disloyal or complicit in imagined plots. In this dark period, the king's longing for control over his personal and political life became all-consuming. His psychological decay not only severed his emotional ties, but also eroded his capacity for empathy, leaving behind a ruler who viewed people as mere instruments to be controlled or discarded. The haunting legacy of Ferdinand's descent was a monarch so engulfed by his internal demons that his reign would be defined as much by his personal torment as by the tragedies inflicted upon his kingdom. In the year 1816, Ferdinand embarked upon his second marriage, selecting Maria Isabel of Portugal, yet another cousin caught in the relentless cycle of royal inbreeding that plagued his lineage. At 19, Maria Isabel arrived at the Spanish court brimming with the innocent optimism common to young princesses entering these arranged unions. Despite the court physicians preparing her ladies-in-waiting for the unusual demands that awaited her, nothing could have truly readied Maria Isabel for the harrowing reality she was about to face. The wedding itself was a grand spectacle of Baroque extravagance, a veneer designed to mask the king's mounting desperation under a reign increasingly synonymous with failure. Draped in cloth of gold, Ferdinand stood at the altar with a visage barely concealing the anxiety that gripped him. In the days leading up to the ceremony, he sought counsel from a range of experts, from physicians and alchemists to a mysterious figure rumored to be an Ottoman specialist in royal afflictions, who had arrived discreetly under the cover of darkness. However, the wedding night proved disastrous, a trauma that would cast a shadow over the remainder of their brief and tragic union. Despite all the painstaking preparations, devices, and consultations brought from across Europe, Ferdinand's anatomical affliction remained an insurmountable barrier. That night's agonized screams echoed ominously through the palace halls. Not cries of passion, but cries of true terror and pain. Servants discovered blood-stained sheets and shattered furniture, grim evidence bearing witness to what resembled medieval torture rather than a union of royalty. Maria Isabel never recovered from that initial ordeal. Court observers noted she developed a pronounced stutter and would visibly shrink away when Ferdinand entered a room. She endured what physicians of the time labeled hysterical episodes, today understood as severe psychological trauma responses. Her ladies-in-waiting often found her waking in night terrors, warning of the monstrous presence that haunted her dreams. Meanwhile, Ferdinand perceived his wife's obvious fear and trauma as a direct affront to his royal dignity. His paranoia, already infamous, deepened into a consuming conviction that Maria Isabel was conspiring with foreign powers to mock his condition. He orchestrated the interception of her correspondence, had her food rigorously tested for poison, and conducted searches of her chambers in relentless pursuit of any sign of betrayal. This convergence of sexual dysfunction and political paranoia transformed Ferdinand's reign into a relentless theater of fear and cruelty. The pressure to produce an heir consumed the royal couple and the court alike. The royal bedchamber was transformed into a laboratory of bizarre medical experiments, pushing the boundaries of human endurance and dignity. On at least one occasion, foreign anatomists and physicians, invited to observe the king's attempts at fatherhood, witnessed these intimate failures firsthand. Their detailed notes and grotesque sketches were circulated through the medical schools of Europe, making Ferdinand's personal affliction an infamous subject of academic study. Isabel, subjected to this unending medical scrutiny and humiliation, spiraled further into psychological collapse. She ceased regular eating, lost a dangerous amount of weight, and adopted a 1,000-yard stare that unnerved even the most seasoned servants. The once vibrant young queen had become a spectral figure confined within the palace she had never truly called home. The political fallout of Ferdinand's private turmoil proved equally catastrophic. Spain's American colonies, already in open revolt, seized upon the king's failure to produce a legitimate heir as symbolic evidence of divine disfavor toward Bourbon rule. Revolutionary propaganda painted Ferdinand as a sexually impotent tyrant whose physical shortcomings mirrored his inability to govern effectively, a stark affront that resonated from Mexico to Argentina. In response, Ferdinand unleashed waves of brutal repression. He reactivated the Inquisition, ordering investigations into cases of sexual slander against the crown, creating an atmosphere of terror where even the most private conversations risked punishment. His obsession with secrecy reached absurd extremes. Hidden passageways were constructed throughout the palace to facilitate secretive movements between his chambers and Isabel's. Strategically placed mirrors were installed to detect eavesdroppers, and a network of spies was deployed solely to monitor palace gossip around the royal marriage. Isabel's health continued its decline under the relentless assault of physical pain and psychological torment. Palace physicians recorded her experience of phantom pregnancies, periods when she showed signs of pregnancy despite being incapable of conception. These false hopes seemed to briefly buoy Ferdinand's desperation, only to be cruelly dashed, driving him into depressive spells that paralyzed governmental affairs. After 2 years marked by this grim cycle of suffering, Isabel's life ended in 1818, a demise officially attributed to nervous exhaustion. Yet private accounts from within the palace suggest she may have intentionally hastened her death through subtle self-harm, a final escape from her living nightmare. Her last moments, as related by her confessor, were prayers of gratitude for deliverance from her torment. Ferdinand's response to Isabel's death revealed the depths of his unraveling psyche. Suspicious of foul play, he ordered multiple autopsies, searched for poison, and arrested several of her attendants on charges of conspiracy. His grief was indistinguishable from paranoia, a vicious spiral of rage and suspicion that engulfed those around him. The Queen's funeral became a macabre occasion, with Ferdinand repeatedly viewing and conversing with her death mask in a haunting ritual. But despite the overwhelming grief and madness, Ferdinand's relentless pursuit of an heir could not be delayed. Within months, his advisors were negotiating marriage prospects for his third wife, unwilling to let personal loss impede the vital quest that had consumed the king's turbulent reign. As Ferdinand's reign dragged on, both his political authority and personal life descended into deeper turmoil. The king found himself increasingly consumed by his obsessive fixation on intimate matters, allowing this preoccupation to overshadow the pressing issues confronting Spain. Revolts were stirring in his distant colonies, signaling the empire's gradual unraveling. Yet Ferdinand's attention remained narrowly focused on the challenges posed by his own physical condition. His inability to produce a legitimate heir weighed heavily on his psyche, compelling him to intermingle his private struggles with the affairs of state. Cabinet meetings were frequently delayed or disrupted by his volatile moods, often triggered by the success or failure of intimate encounters with his wife. This fixation eroded the effectiveness of his governance, fostering instability within the court and beyond. Meanwhile, the colonies, emboldened by Spain's internal distraction, intensified their push for independence. The king's failure to address these crises decisively allowed revolutionary fervor to spread unchecked. Yet Ferdinand's response was less political strategy and more an extension of his personal paranoia. He launched purges targeting those he suspected of undermining his reign or mocking his private afflictions. Thus, what began as private dysfunction infiltrated the core of his monarchy, blurring the lines between personal agony and political decay. His obsession with royal succession and the physical barriers to it thus became inseparable from the broader disintegration of Spanish power, marking his rule as a period where personal crisis and national collapse were tragically entwined. Years into his troubled reign, Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir grew to desperate extremes. Haunted by his physical affliction and the repeated failures of his previous marriages, the king's fixation on fathering a successor consumed his every waking thought. This obsession led him down a path of increasingly erratic and bizarre behavior. He commissioned the creation of ever more elaborate and specialized devices designed to accommodate his unique anatomy, pushing the boundaries of contemporary medicine and ingenuity. Secret workshops within the palace churned out custom cushions, restraints, and medical apparatuses meant to facilitate his intimate encounters while minimizing harm to his wives. Simultaneously, Ferdinand delved deeper into the realm of the arcane and the mystical, consulting astrologers, alchemists, and mystics from far-flung corners of Europe and beyond. He was captivated by promises of potions and rituals that could either normalize his condition or enhance his fertility. Among these efforts was a notably strange episode where, for months, the king and his queen were subjected to ceremonies inspired by ancient Eastern traditions, all in hopes of unlocking a divine blessing upon their union. His relentless drive to overcome nature's cruel impediment strained his personal relationships to the breaking point. Wives suffered both physically and psychologically, enduring repeated traumas under the weight of their royal duties. The royal bedchamber, intended as a place of intimacy, became instead a harsh theater of medicalized attempts at procreation, clinical, mechanical, and void of affection. The failure to produce a living heir continued to frustrate Ferdinand, deepening his paranoia and cruelty. Each miscarriage or stillbirth was not only a personal heartbreak, but also a blow to his sense of masculinity and sovereignty. These losses intensified his suspicion of those closest to him, fueling a cycle of surveillance, accusation, and fear that permeated the very fabric of the court. In this desperate pursuit of heirs, Ferdinand's personal torment became inseparable from the fate of Spain itself. This fixation distracted him from ruling effectively and contributed to the growing instability of his kingdom. The toxic mix of his physical affliction, psychological scars, and political power drove a wedge between the monarchy and the people, leaving a legacy defined by both personal and national tragedy. As the years stretched on, Ferdinand's relentless pursuit of an heir persisted, undeterred by the suffering and despair that had accompanied his earlier marriages. His third wife, Maria Joseph Amalia of Saxony, arrived in Madrid in 1819 with a pragmatic understanding of the trial she would face. Prepared through prior consultations and carrying her own collection of medical aids, Maria Joseph treated her marriage as a clinical challenge, meticulously documenting their encounters as if they were experiments rather than acts of intimacy. Despite this practiced approach, the fundamental impossibility of Ferdinand's condition remained. Their conjugal life unfolded with regimented precision, a series of medically supervised attempts resembling surgical procedures more than displays of affection. Ferdinand's paranoia deepened, fueled by suspicions that Maria Joseph viewed him merely as a subject of curiosity and might be divulging state secrets regarding his anatomical plight to foreign powers. As political turmoil engulfed Spain and its colonies declared independence, Ferdinand's obsession with his personal afflictions left him incapable of managing the empire's crises. When, after a decade of clinical matrimony, Maria Joseph finally became pregnant in 1829, the court erupted in cautious optimism. The king's elation was tempered by fevered fears, prompting him to summon the finest European physicians and order layers of supernatural protections around the queen. The pregnancy initially proceeded without incident, but tragedy struck in the 7th month when Maria Joseph suffered severe complications, likely placental abruption. Rather than allowing expert medical care to prevail, Ferdinand's interference, consulting mystics alongside doctors, created confusion and chaos. On May 18th, the Queen went into premature labor under the king's increasingly irrational supervision, a harrowing ordeal, leaving a fragile daughter who survived only a few hours. Maria Joseph herself succumbed 3 weeks later to a combination of infection and profound despair. Ferdinand, unable to accept his losses, refused burial rites for both, demanding futile attempts at resuscitation that left the palace steeped in decay and sorrow. The ensuing psychological collapse climaxed in a deep depression. The king withdrew from public life, obsessively fixating on death masks of his deceased wives, grim tokens symbolizing a legacy marked by personal and national tragedy. Yet, fate dealt one final cruel hand when, in 1829, Ferdinand entered into a fourth marriage with Maria Cristina of Naples. Unbeknownst to him before their union, she was already pregnant by another man. Despite this, the desperate king embraced Maria Cristina's child, Isabella II, as his own, clinging to the fragile hope of securing his dynasty amid the spiraling dysfunction that had defined his reign. These final attempts at fatherhood, fraught with deception, obsession, and heartbreak, underscored the tragic intertwining of Ferdinand's personal afflictions with the fate of Spain, a kingdom unraveling under the weight of its monarch's private torment. As Ferdinand III entered his fourth marriage, the hopes for securing a legitimate heir mounted to desperate heights. At 45 years old, he wed Maria Cristina of Naples, a union marred from the start by an undeniable secret. Maria Cristina arrived at the Spanish court already pregnant by another man. This farcical marriage in 1829 merely deceived the public, as the visibly pregnant bride carried a child that could never be Ferdinand's. Yet, the king, blinded by his longing for an heir, accepted the deception, convinced that fate had answered his prayers through unexpected means. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have symbolized the culmination of Ferdinand's quest, but instead, it became a new source of torment. Though aware that Isabella was not his biological daughter, Ferdinand was compelled to maintain the illusion of legitimacy to preserve the dynasty. His relationship with Maria Cristina was one built upon mutual pretense. She feigned respect, while he feigned belief in her child's paternity. In his final years, Ferdinand continued to struggle with his persistent sexual dysfunction, now compounded by the anxiety of upholding a counterfeit succession. His drives to produce a biological heir to the throne remained unfulfilled, witnessed by the same procession of physicians and specialists who had observed his earlier failures. As his age advanced and success grew ever more unlikely, his paranoia escalated to shocking levels, even among courtiers long accustomed to his erratic behavior. Ferdinand conducted surprise inspections of Maria Cristina's chambers at unpredictable hours, arriving with armed guards to accuse her of conspiracies conceived solely in his mind. These midnight raids subjected the Queen's ladies-in-waiting to constant terror, uncertain when a monarch's wild-eyed accusations would descend upon them. His obsession with surveillance extended to the installation of peepholes between their private quarters, where he would spend hours watching Maria Cristina in her most intimate and vulnerable moments, nursing Isabella, praying, or simply reflecting. Conscious of this incessant observation, the Queen moved warily within her own rooms, like a captive, ever mindful of every gesture and expression. The king's rituals of suspicion grew increasingly elaborate. Not only did he demand that every dish be tasted before he could eat, but he also insisted tasters wait half an hour between sampling and serving to allow for any slow-acting poison to take effect. The strain of this suspicion drove several food tasters to collapse from nervous exhaustion, further feeding Ferdinand's belief that assassination attempts were imminent. Caught in this web of mistrust, Maria Cristina's own mental health eroded. Letters she wrote to her family in Naples, intercepted and scrutinized by the king's spies, chronicled a woman slipping into madness. She professed feelings of constant surveillance, sudden frighted shadows, and an inability to place trust even in her closest attendants. Her existence became that of a cage performer, forced to maintain an unbroken facade of serenity even within her dreams. Ferdinand's paranoia extended beyond his marriage to engulf the entire court. He rotated his personal guards daily, fearing prolonged service would lead to betrayal. Cabinet ministers endured loyalty tests so absurd they bordered on the farcical. The king would purposely make contradictory statements to gauge their reactions, interpreting any correction as treason. Spain's once cultured court devolved into a theater of whispered accusations, coded language, and fragile alliances, where a careless word could mean exile or imprisonment. His relationship with infant Isabella became a focus of pathological anxiety. Despite knowing she was not his child, Ferdinand both cherished and resented the girl as evidence of his sexual failure. He spent countless hours scrutinizing her features, commissioning portraits at each stage of her infancy, and comparing them meticulously against images of himself and Maria Cristina's former lovers, desperate to find proof of her paternity. This agonizing contradiction gnawed at him. The very heir to his throne served as a cruel testament to the impotence that had plagued his reign. In his quest for reassurance, Ferdinand consulted genealogists and physicians, yearning for scientific validation of Isabella's legitimacy. Aware of the danger their testimony posed, these experts crafted ambiguous reports, allowing the king to interpret their findings as he wished, while preserving their own positions. Ferdinand's control over Maria Cristina became increasingly invasive. He assigned confidants to oversee her daily activities, monitor her correspondence, and report on every interaction, down to the duration of her prayers, the books she read, and the courtiers she encountered. In response, the Queen marshaled immense psychological resilience, compartmentalizing her anguish behind a composed public demeanor. A personal diary, discovered centuries later concealed behind a false wall, revealed the heavy toll of constant scrutiny as she likened herself to an actress forced to maintain her role, even in sleep. On the international stage, Ferdinand's erratic conduct raised alarms. Foreign diplomats relayed concerns over Spain's unstable leadership, stalling alliances and negotiations. His obsession with shadows and plots worsened. Innocent requests, such as Maria Christina's wish to redecorate her chambers, were seen as sinister efforts to conceal weapons or poisons. Compliments to the Queen invited suspicion of coded treason, and even her religious devotions were questioned as secret communications with foreign powers. The economic consequences of the king's paranoia were staggering. Lavish expenditures on security, espionage, and loyalty tests drained a royal treasury, while the Spanish populace suffered in poverty. Ferdinand commissioned hidden passages throughout the palace, elaborate alarm systems, and maintained multiple layers of food tasters and guards, all measures draining vital resources from a collapsing nation. Under this relentless pressure, Ferdinand's health declined. Palace physicians documented chronic insomnia, digestive ailments, and early signs of cognitive deterioration. His speeches became rambling diatribes laced with accusations against unseen enemies and fabricated conspiracies. Within his family, trust disintegrated. Ferdinand grew suspicious even of his closest kin, interpreting ordinary interactions as threats. Birthdays became fraught occasions where he scrutinized gifts and decorations for signs of betrayal. His brother Don Carlos, once a steadfast ally, found himself under investigation. Maria Christina's efforts to shield Isabella from this environment only served to heighten the king's suspicions. Requests for private time with their daughter were viewed as schemes to indoctrinate the heir into foreign hands. Motherly bonding became perceived acts of subversion in Ferdinand's paranoid worldview. Servants caught in this atmosphere of distrust suffered greatly, tasked with loyalty reports while maintaining an outward appearance of devotion. Many developed nervous disorders or fled the court altogether. Newcomers often unwittingly triggered Ferdinand's suspicions through innocent mistakes, further destabilizing palace life. Ferdinand's desperation to uncover Isabella's true paternity spawned exhaustive investigations. He ordered dossiers compiled on every man who had been close to Maria Christina during her time in Naples, analyzing physical traits, medical histories, and even personal letters dating years prior. His chambers became a haunting museum, filled with portraits of his deceased wives, failed medical instruments, and religious relics representing his hopes for divine relief from his plight. Visitors to this grim suite recounted an oppressive sadness that clung to the walls. Here, Ferdinand held court amid reminders of his intimate failures, conducting affairs of state while shadowed by his personal torment. As tensions rose, Maria Christina began to suffer visible symptoms of stress: hair thinning, weight fluctuations, and tremors, all artfully concealed during public appearances. Her ladies-in-waiting observed new nervous habits, constant vigilance, and startled reactions to sudden noises. In 1832, the king's paranoia reached an appalling peak. Convinced the Queen sought to poison him through physical contact, he demanded medical examinations before any intimacy. These assessments in the twilight of Ferdinand II's reign, the heavy weight of paranoia and personal dysfunction bore down upon him with relentless force, hastening both his mental and physical decline. His paranoia tangled with his illness, dragging him deeper into isolation, while his erratic behavior plunged the nation into political chaos. Ferdinand's spiraling distrust led to a violent purging of suspected conspirators within his court, creating a climate of fear that crippled effective governance. As his health worsened, his speeches grew incoherent, peppered with accusations of phantom enemies and imaginary plots. reflecting a monarch unraveling before the eyes of his subjects. The government stalled under his erratic command, and rebellions simmered not only in distant colonies but stirred unrest within the heart of Spain itself. His inability to reconcile personal anguish with political duty accelerated the erosion of royal authority. When Ferdinand finally succumbed to his ailments in 1833, it was not with a grandeur befitting a king, but with the quiet fading of a man consumed by his internal torment. His death marked the disintegration of the once mighty Spanish monarchy, leaving behind a fractured nation grappling with the consequences of a ruler whose personal demons had devastated an empire. In 1834, a royal physician in a Madrid palace faced a grim and unprecedented task: preserving the body of the recently deceased King Ferdinand II. Beyond his visage lay an anatomical anomaly that would forever mark his reign. An extraordinarily large and grotesquely shaped endowment that symbolized both his deepest shame and twisted pride. This physical deformity, a consequence of generations of inbreeding among the Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons, profoundly influenced Ferdinand's troubled life and reign. Born into a lineage riddled with genetic defects, Ferdinand's childhood and adolescence were marred by a psychological suffering and social humiliation. The court whispered and laughed at his condition, leading to a cruel resentment that shaped his tyrannical and paranoid rule. His marriages, starting with his first wife Maria Antonia, devolved into nightmares of humiliation and trauma, as special medical interventions and restraints were required to endure intimate relations. These attempts to fulfill his dynastic duty only deepened his own psychological wounds and those of his wives. Ferdinand's reign was plagued not only by personal agony, but also by mounting political crises, including colonial revolts and economic decline. His obsession with producing a legitimate heir drove him to increasingly bizarre behaviors, consulting mystics, employing medical experiments, and orchestrating oppressive surveillance even within his own palace. His fourth marriage brought the birth of Isabella II, a child whose paternity was dubious, fueling the king's paranoia and the fraught dynamics within the royal family. Ultimately, Ferdinand's profound personal dysfunction and paranoia accelerated Spain's descent into political instability and ruin. Upon his death, the autopsy revealed not only the physical deformities that had haunted him, but also signs of self-inflicted injuries born from his desperate attempts to alter his condition. The preserved organ and detailed medical records were hidden in the Vatican archives, a haunting testament to the intimate torment behind his public reign. Ferdinand II's legacy is one shadowed by shame and tragedy, a vivid illustration of how individual afflictions can reverberate through history, undermining nations and shattering lives. His reign leaves behind a fractured Spain, fractured families, and a cautionary tale of how personal calamities, left unchecked and entwined with absolute power, can become a national catastrophe. Ferdinand II's life stands as a stark warning of how deeply personal afflictions can ripple outward to shape the course of a nation's history. This story reveals the disastrous consequences when a leader's private failures intertwine with public duty, transforming intimate suffering into national tragedy. The legacy he left behind: a fractured Spain burdened by civil strife, economic collapse, and diminished influence, underscores the peril of concentrated power in the hands of those ill-equipped to wield it. Ultimately, Ferdinand's reign illustrates that the weight of personal dysfunction, when vested with authority, can unleash far-reaching damage well beyond the individual, echoing through generations and reminding us of the human cost borne by those caught in the crossfire of misguided monarchy. If this grim and astonishing tale of Ferdinand II's troubled reign captivated you, please consider subscribing to the channel for more revealing glimpses into the hidden facets of history. Your likes and comments help bring these forgotten stories to light, and sharing this narrative with others can spark meaningful conversations about the impact of personal trials on the course of nations. Join us in unraveling the complex tapestry of the past, connecting across time through our shared curiosity.